Before we get into this, I'm just going to say there's a lot of heavy topics in this. You have been warned. Hello my disciples, Father Andrew here, and welcome to the character cross-section Cry of Fear mega episode, which will combine all of my Cry of Fear videos into one long video, with some editing to combine them all into one coherent video. This video will be talking about every single character and every single monster from the game, in depth. But anyway, with that out of the way, now to get into the video. Starting with the main character himself, Simon Henriksson from Cry of Fear. As to who he is, Simon is the protagonist of Cry of Fear. Giving an overview of his character, little is known about his school or personal life. Something his doctor, Dr. Purnell, his counsellor, notes as topics Simon refuses to discuss. Simon has been known to self-harm as indicated by the cuts on his left wrist when the player heals using the morphine syringes. Story-wise, it's also suggested that Simon lives with his mother. The significance of this could be that she possibly helps him with his visits to Dr. Purnell. However, this is not made fully clear as the cutscenes outside of the game's events, set within the book Simon is writing, show him in a different apartment on his own. There is also no mention of a father or other relatives throughout the story, so functionally they don't exist as far as the story is concerned. As previously mentioned in the intro, Simon is known to suffer with depression, and he only has one friend outside of his home, that being Sophie, who he had romantic feelings for, albeit they were rejected. All of that being a very general overview of his character. Further elaborating on his background, which I used as the intro for this video in a summarised form, there's a bit more information on Simon. Hinted through dialogue and flashbacks, Simon grew up in his hometown of Kirkville with his mother. As mentioned, nothing is mentioned about the father. It's also hinted that Simon's mother is overprotective, shown by the text he gets throughout the game, meaning that Simon likely did not socialise with others in his younger years. During his lifetime, Dr. Purnell has stated that Simon has lived with psychological problems for a long time, which has been diagnosed to be anxiety and depression, which Simon himself claims to be generated by his loneliness. Simon occasionally taking a train to Stockholm and walking lonely around the city as a way of coping with these feelings, and an ashtray in his apartment shows that he's an occasional smoker. And from the appearance of Simon's bag, it's implied that he's a fan of heavy metal music, the logo on the back of his hoodie adding to this as well, albeit this changes to suicidal black metal after the main events of the plot begin. And in regards to Sophie, she is referred to Simon as being the only male at college who would actually help her through her troubling times, making her life more bearable. But after Simon confessed his feelings and she rejected him, Simon insisted that he loved her, she backed away from him saying that she had to leave for somewhere, and her rejection completely debilitated him hardcore, and he went as far as to blame himself, that she would choose to reject him. And for a while, Simon was completely unable to move aside from the pain of her rejection, but this completely depends on gameplay choices made by the player throughout the story. Simon will either allow his emotions to fester to a point where it punishes both him and Sophie, or despite being hurt, he'll move on. And the last part of the intro that involved the switchblade and the morphine, I don't even need to really elaborate on that because there's not much to it. Anyway, moving on to the actual events of the game and its story. Simon, as we've already mentioned, diagnosed with anxiety and depression. Before the events of Cry of Fear, as seen in the first cutscene of the game, he was the victim of a hit and run, in which he came across a man who was on the ground in the middle of the night, tried to help him, and then was slammed into a wall by a car, crushing his spine, which crippled him from the waist down and confined him to a wheelchair for the rest of his life, subjecting him to further mental trauma which drove him to becoming reclusive and spiteful of his own life. Dr. Purnell being assigned to Simon as his psychologist after the incident. Dr. Purnell going on to use cognitive therapy as a treatment method, the method consisting of Simon being instructed to write a book about his emotions and anxiety to get all the trauma out of his head, and the trauma he had suffered from what he insists on calling the Black Day, the day in which he was crippled, which is essentially called vent writing, which is an actual well-known method people use for coping with their emotions, as it provides a safe space to let out everything going on in your head. But anyway, Simon authored the book as instructed and the events of Cry of Fear begin, the events that unfold being a metaphorical depiction of Simon's mind and the battle to purge his inner demons through his writing. The actions taken during the game showing us how well the therapy works, which is going to vary depending on the critical choices you make throughout the plot. But ultimately, each boss fight represents a major point in his life to where he has suffered some sort of trauma, or the many metaphors in-game representing the state of his mind. And in addition to this, the Simon we play as throughout Cry of Fear is in fact a mental projection of Simon himself, acting as a self-insert into his own book so he can actually combat his traumas, the fate of both Simons depending on what ending is unlocked due to the actions made throughout the game. his fate now being the section we're going to discuss. The main single player story has 4 endings. The first 3 endings involve Simon committing suicide with slight variations of the fates of the other characters. The real Simon ending his own life is shown metaphorically in his mind, as the projection you play as is subjected to another nightmare, and forced to work his way to sick Simon still stuck in his wheelchair, in which a fight ensues and he kills the real Simon, via killing sick Simon who is in a wheelchair and a stand-in for the real one, ultimately killing himself in the process and ending the game with one of the first 3 endings, and Simon leaving a declaration in his book which varies depending on what choices were made. But there are 2 major choices in the game that decide which ending you get: if the player kills or spares the monster known as Carcass, and if they trust Dr. Purnell with the gun or not. Sparing Carcass and refusing to trust the Doctor results in ending 1, the worst ending, in which the therapy fails outright and Simon develops a deep hatred for the world around him. He begins to show signs of possible paranoid schizophrenia, believing that the world viewed him negatively, and were looking down on him because of his disability, never caring about him all along. Ultimately, his delusions and depressive spiral causes him to feel betrayed by Sophie, and makes him feel like the Doctor had made his depression worse and was mocking him, so he proceeds to go psychotic and kill both of them and then himself. And he wanted to kill others but simply couldn't due to his situation making that impossible. He then proceeds to write his suicide note and kill himself, and the nature of the note being macabre and sinister. He expresses his belief that the world was laughing at him because of his disability, tries to justify himself killing Sophie and Purnell, confesses that if it weren't for his disability he would have done far worse, and attacks whoever finds his remains verbally, wishing that whoever finds his body to be haunted for the rest of their life. Ending 2 is unlocked if Simon spares Carcass and trusts Dr. Purnell with the gun. In this ending, Simon shows respect for Purnell and his efforts to help Simon, but ultimately believes that it was futile. He came to the resolution that his life meant nothing and he was unable to move past the pain of the rejection, and he possessively murders her to keep her to himself, willing to leave her for anyone else to have. Before then killing himself, he then leaves a suicide note in his diary apologising to Purnell for the results of the therapy, but overall thanks him for actually trying to help him. And then there's ending 3. This is unlocked if Simon killed Carcass but refuses to trust Purnell with the gun. It's pretty much a reverse of ending 2. While Simon still feels the pain of Sophie's rejection of him, and feels extreme guilt because of the damage his slip into depression and psychosis did to her, he's able to forgive her and moves past the rejection, even coming to regard her as the only person who truly cared about him. However, he couldn't trust Dr. Purnell, and comes to the conclusion that his treatment has only made his condition worse and the book has showed him how broken he really was. And so he proceeds to murder Dr. Purnell in a fit of self-absorbed revenge before taking his own life, leaving behind a suicide note pleading with anyone who finds his remains to not show them to Sophie, showing that he actually cared about her in the end. These 3 endings being the bad endings of the game. And with those, now to talk about the 4th arguably good ending, unlocked by killing Carcass and trusting Dr. Purnell with the gun. In this ending, Simon doesn't take the life of Sophie nor the Doctor, and does not commit suicide. This being prevented by a hallucination in which Book Simon arrives. The real Simon then has to battle his way through another nightmare while in his wheelchair, and engages his mental counterpart in a running gunfight, eventually managing to defeat Book Simon and shooting him to death, showing that his mind no longer needs to rely on the visage he created, and that he's finally been released from the collective stress of his trauma. The psychotic hallucination ends and it's revealed that Simon did not really shoot his twisted self, but instead 2 police officers who entered his apartment to check on him. After this, doctors testify in court that Simon was having a psychotic episode, and although he feels guilty for killing the officers, he is committed to a mental hospital, in which Dr. Purnell continues to act as Simon's counsellor and mentor, a service he is grateful for. Sophie regularly visits Simon in the hospital when she is allowed, doctors saying that her visits are, and I quote, destabilising him, although Simon makes note of the fact that she has found a new male friend and wishes her nothing but the best, Simon even going on to give himself a happy ending in the book, which represents him finally coming to terms with the depression, allowing himself to start being treated. And with that, those are the 4 main endings of Cry of Fear. I'm going to be skipping over the secret ending and the Doctor's story ending because they aren't canonically connected. David Leverhoff from Afraid of Monsters does appear in the secret ending, but I think that's more or less just a joke or a cameo ending. But then there's also the co-op campaign ending, which I'm going to go over now, which serves as a final epilogue scenario, in which several police officers enter his apartment and then enter his book mental realm, intending to, for unknown reasons, change Simon's past and save him from the hit-and-run incident, the campaign concluding with them travelling through time, and managing to arrive to the location just before it could happen to arrest the driver and prevent it from ever happening, preventing the events of the game entirely. A short scene then happens showing Simon and Sophie having apparently begun a relationship after all, walking down the sidewalk holding hands, I personally don't feel like this ending is canon because it just kind of undoes the whole plot, and it's probably just an alternate storyline sort of like Doctor Mode, in which you play as Dr. Purnell. And with that, now to move on to the trivia before I give my thoughts on the character. Firstly, Simon's full name can be found on the strange package earned in Ending 4, which gives you the secret ending, when the package is delivered, to the mailbox located by the college. Secondly, the back of Simon's hoodie appears to be the logo for a public event called the Freedom Music Festival. Thirdly, possibly for user-friendly purposes, Simon dual wields a handgun or a melee weapon in his left hand, and the other optional item like a flashlight will be in his right hand, which could imply that Simon is left-handed, or ambidextrous if I'm pronouncing that correctly. In real life, the P345 is not an ambidextrous weapon and is designed for right-hand shooters, so it's likely that Simon wouldn't find it easy or comfortable to use with his left hand. Fourthly, Simon's first model is still found in the first nightmare sequence when he punches the mirror. His first model can also be found in the Depressed Simon Easter egg. Fifthly, one of the hurt sounds of Simon is in fact cursing. The line is "ah, fan," which translates from Swedish to "ah, damn." And with that covered, now to give my thoughts on the character. My thoughts are, Simon's story ultimately represents the devastating consequences a life-changing injury can have on someone, not just physically but mentally and emotionally. Even more so when that person is already vulnerable. In addition to this, the negative effects one can face when psychological treatment goes wrong is also a main focus of the plot, plus the consequences of that depending on what ending the player gets. The book version of Dr. Purnell shooting Simon in the game is a metaphor for the potential real-world damage Purnell's treatment could have had on Simon, and stems directly from this theme. And all the enemies Simon goes against draw from this narrative, as they are all reflections of his mental state and treatment process. One of the enemies in particular is literally named after a medication, the citalopram, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which as a medication is known to have side effects that may make a person's problems worse. The citalopram likely being a medication Simon was prescribed by Dr. Purnell in the real world outside of the events of the book. As in some of the endings, when Simon kills himself, he mentions taking some extra pills, these possibly being the medication he was prescribed. And his journey through his collapsing mind via the book is all metaphorical, but is functionally similar to the goal of Silent Hill, to force character growth, as far as the plot is concerned, albeit with distinct differences and methods, which is fitting given that Silent Hill was a partial inspiration for Cry of Fear. But it's also worth noting that the monsters in both games are designed differently, and exist for different reasons. The ones in Cry of Fear are all specifically connected to Simon, while throughout the Silent Hill franchise they're connected to various different people. James Sunderland has Pyramid Head, and is a manifestation of his guilt. The Abstract Daddy represents Angela's sexual abuse by her father. The Butcher from Silent Hill Origins is connected to Travis Grady, symbolizing the brutality of the cult known as the Order, Travis's inner rage and pent-up anger, among other creatures connected to other characters. But ultimately, both games have these monsters to serve the same purpose. They represent something, key to the plot and to the main characters. Silent Hill just does it in a more flexible way, by having the cult and the dark gods involved. While Simon's is stiffer, so from a writing perspective it's harder to bring an external character outside of his story into it. There's no explainable mechanism for the monsters becoming physically real, so the plot of Doctor Mode physically and chronologically just cannot fit in with the main game's timeline. Nor can the multiplayer co-op ending. And that, my audience, is what we call a writing choice based limitation. The way you as a writer can get around this is by pre-planning these kind of things out and preemptively setting up something earlier in the story that would allow you to get around this, which necessitates you as the author having a vision of what you're doing, which is pretty easy to do as a writer by simply writing up a plot graph and using that to have a sense of direction, or creating a timeline of events that need to be followed. But yeah, with that, that's my thoughts on Simon. Now I'm going to give you a slight break before we move on to cover the monsters. I'm going to give you 5 seconds to pause so you can take a break. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Alright, with that, now to talk about the various monsters of Cry of Fear, each one being a construct of Simon's mind, born from his trauma, the aforementioned Simon being the game's protagonist. For further elaboration on who he is, see my previous Cry of Fear video, as this video in particular is focused on the monsters and the bosses, what each one represents and some general information on them. Albeit I'll be doing this in a way where monsters with similar or the same symbolic meaning will be grouped together as to not waste time. And with that, getting straight into it, starting with the first monster, the Crawlers. Crawlers typically look like the one on the left, but the one on the right only appears once. Crawlers themselves are a rare encounter that only happens around ventilation systems and tight areas. They move fast, just as fast as the Croucher, and can catch up to you incredibly quickly, albeit they have to stop to attack and their attacks are fairly slow, so evading them is rather easy. The second variation of the Crawler which has the crawler's body and the head of a citalopram, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That specific variant appears at the end of a long vent system in the subway. It is functionally the same as the common version, albeit this is the only place where you can find it. This creature being named the Crypandinage, if I'm pronouncing that name correctly. This singular variation spawning an event that leads to the Remington 870 shotgun. The common crawler and its rare version the Crypandinage both represent the same thing, Simon's crippled state, as both variants drag themselves with their arms, but the Crypandinage in particular has especially broken legs, as both represent Simon being injured in the hit and run incident, just like the next 3 monsters we're going to discuss. Moving on to the next monster, we have the Croucher, which is a variation of the slower and faceless enemies that walks on 4 limbs, easily able to duck under most of your melee attacks and attack your legs. This variant of both enemies only showing up after fighting the Sora boss in the basement of the apartments, albeit once you finish this section and leave they don't spawn for the rest of the game, and regarding actually dealing with them, it's quite possible to just jump over them without taking any damage. They also can't attack you while you're on top of them, which makes them extremely vulnerable, and if you're extremely bored you could actually try and ride one using this tactic. Regarding their relevance to Simon, however, they less represent his injury and more his shift in perspective, him being lower to the ground. And with that, now onto the next monster, that being the Slower, the most common and early enemies you come across throughout the game. They come in 3 different aesthetic colour variants: red sweater, navy jumper, and green striped shirts, albeit there are less common, more unique variants. Regarding them, despite being named slowers, they're not particularly slow, varying between erratic limping shuffles and maddening flailing dashes, with their heads locked onto you with every jagged jolt and convulsion, sometimes smashing into objects in the environment only to shuffle wildly, albeit when they're close distance with the player they'll swing their hammer in a distinct pattern, being usually from right to left or upwards several times. And despite them not being the strongest foes you can go against, they are the most often you'll find, especially in the early game when you're armed with just a knife, which makes them particularly threatening in the harder difficulties. Their violent body movements also make landing headshots difficult, so it's advised you either have really good skill at getting headshots on these things or you go for body shots or melee, all while keeping yourself away from corners to not get trapped, albeit fighting them with the knife is the only thing you can really do early game. When they take initial damage they'll get stunned, allowing you to get some actual hits in on them. You can get 3 to 4 safe knife stabs on them while the creature is recoiling, which is something you should learn if you're playing the game on Nightmare or Hard mode. They also have a behaviour where they'll enter an attack stance. If you approach them in this stance, they can very quickly follow up with additional attacks, and they can get some hits on you even if you dodge backwards. The animation they do, which is a warning sign of this, is them basically ducking down, or holding out their hammer ready to attack, and when they do so, avoid knifing them in the few seconds after you've provoked them to attack or you'll likely take a hit or two. Now let's just quickly skim through the variants of these guys. Type 1 is the regular ones you find throughout most of the earlier parts of the game. Slow attack speed, slow movement speed, they also appear in the later parts as a jump scare. The second variant is that special variant of Crawler we mentioned. Type 3 is one that wears a grey boiler suit and a mask and resembles Michael Myers, appearing mainly in the middle and latter sections of the game, noticeably more durable than the previous 2, and they move and attack faster. Next variant is referred to as Slower No, a special 3-headed version that appears once in the entire main campaign, just like the upper enemies who we'll be talking about later. It is found exclusively inside the TL Trading AB building, and spawns after the player picks up a Glock 19 magazine that comes with an exceedingly loud screaming voice, although they're not very tough to defeat, albeit it appears more in the co-op campaign. Next version is Slower 10-1. They are slowers, albeit they've been entangled in red tentacles similar to the appendages of the human flower, these most likely existing to apply some sort of misdirection to those who didn't pay attention to the plot towards the beginning of the game, as they look like something that would be the result of some sort of biological outbreak. And lastly, we have Slower 10-2. These variants cannot move as they're pinned to the wall by the red tendrils, albeit they can still hit you if you get too close to them. When it comes to a little bit of tactical information, it's pretty easy to kill Slower 3 and Slower 10-2. Easy way to do with Slower 3 is just pistol whip it and shoot it in the face, while 10-2 can only attack things in front of it, so just attack it from the side. With that, now to cover their relevance to Simon. They essentially symbolise how Simon struggles with his own physical limitations, due to the non-functioning of his legs, ultimately representing his helplessness and frustration, their sluggish impaired movements, reflecting Simon's lack of mobility, as he tries to navigate the world with these problems. And with that, now to cover the last monster of this section, that being the Upper. These creatures are just a rare version of the Slower that can be killed the same way. When encountered, they kick at you with their broken limbs in different directions, and upon spawning, they unleash a violent scream that lasts for several seconds, a particularly loud, very noticeably pained wail that you are not going to be ignoring anytime soon. This particular enemy only appearing once in the single player campaign, but can appear up to several times in the co-op campaign. Regarding its relevance to Simon, this one's fairly obvious, but in case you don't get it, it represents the moment Simon got hit by the car, and the loud wail is him screaming in agony as his legs are folded like a fucking omelette. And it running using its arms represents not just his legs not working, but him having to use his arms to move the wheelchair around. And with that, that's the upper covered, along with all the monsters that represent Simon being crippled in a more direct manner. Now to move on to the ones that represent him being in a wheelchair bound state. First up in this category we have the Faster, which comes in two variants, male and female. These creatures are first encountered in the apartments, the female being the one you encounter first. It lets out piercing screams and attacks by slashing and stabbing with its iron arms, its lower legs consisting of the same metal spikes as its arms. These metallic limbs giving it a distinct walking sound. When killed, in its death animation it stabs itself in the neck, falls to the ground and lets out a sad painful wail, the one we discussed being the first variant. The second variant only appears in Doctor mode and Cooperative mode, being found in the apartments in place of the first variant. It also appears in the Co-op campaign, in an optional house in the forest, and in the aforementioned Doctor mode. The second variant has a cage growing out of its shoulders forming around its head, which makes it impossible to kill the creature with a headshot. And it's also worth noting that the male version has a distinct lack of blood coating its limbs, only having spots of what appear to be rust. In regards to the relevancy to Simon, both variants, having metallic appendages, replacing their limbs, could represent how Simon's legs got replaced by a metallic wheelchair after the hit and run, and the cage on the male version could represent how Simon feels trapped. The creature stabbing itself when killed could represent Simon wanting to kill himself, which makes sense given that 3 out of 4 endings involve Simon dying. And with that, moving on to the next enemy, we have the Human Flower, a mass of writhing flesh with multiple tendrils and limbs and faces emerging from it, alongside a giant arm it uses to strike at the player. It's not exactly an enemy and more an obstruction or an environmental hazard. It can't be killed by direct damage from the player, so all you can really do is either bypass it or find an alternate means of killing it. Regarding how it works, this thing will instantly kill you if you get within range. So if you're getting attacked by a group of enemies, make sure you're not accidentally getting pushed towards this thing. This thing appears twice in the main game, on Ronald Street and in the subway. The one on Ronald Street you have to avoid, but the one in the subway is killed by ramming a train into it, allowing you to safely pass by. Albeit this one will instead hit you and damage you similar to the Wattrose if you get near it, and it appears in Doctor mode and needs to be avoided just like in the main game. Also, developer commentary claims that the creature was created to trick the player into thinking that a biological outbreak was responsible for the monster's existence. The Human Flower was supposed to at one point be shown expanding across the city and assimilating any slowers it came into contact with some versions of the slower having tendrils growing throughout their body similar to ones we mentioned earlier. Albeit we only see 2 of them, so this idea was clearly not followed through. Albeit regarding its relevance to Simon, the creature's hideous form most likely represents how Simon views the current state of his body, and the creature being rooted in place most likely represents how Simon feels stuck in his current situation. And with that, those are the monsters that represent Simon being stuck in a wheelchair bound state. Now to cover the ones that have relations to the world around Simon and its events, which is going to be incredibly quick because there's just 2 of these guys. The first of these is the baby, these little shitters being the weakest enemy in the whole game, after you pick up the key to the neighbour's door. Albeit they only spawn, functionally they have no real purpose other than to ambush the player. They charge at you upon seeing you, and when they reach you their heads explode and a spike launches out of them, which kills the creature in the process. Albeit this spike does deal a decent bit of damage. Regarding their relevancy to Simon, considering they only spawn after you get the key to the neighbour across his apartment, it could be that they represent younglings of his neighbours. Also, I have to use the word youngling because YouTube doesn't like the C or the K word. But anyway, it's possible he found them annoying and that's why they're just stupid little ambush enemies, but the creatures attack via suicide, which could be a parallel to how Simon has felt alone his entire life, and has possibly contemplated ending his own life for a while, which is exactly what happens in 3 out of the 4 endings. But yeah, anyway, moving on to the next enemy. We have the C word I can't say, so we're going to call them younglings. These not as little shitters, they're only encountered in the apartments, and are very similar to the slowers in terms of combat, in that they move fast and rely on melee, albeit they attack by rushing your legs and slashing at you in 2-hit combos. They're also significantly smaller, which makes them harder to hit, and their rate of attack is considerably quick, which makes them exceedingly dangerous if not outright deadly if you get cornered by one. But when it comes to countering them, if you have a good supply of ammo handy, it is very much recommended you just pop a few caps in the wee bastards, albeit if you're forced into using melee, try to keep them in the most open area readily available to you. Move in for a quick hit or 2 then dodge back before they can counter. And we're at now to cover their relevance to Simon. While there's not too much relevance between these creatures and Simon himself, it's more directed to the PDF serial killer that used to live in the same building as him. I really want to call it what it is, but unfortunately I can't because this fucking website sucks. but essentially these creatures represent his victims, which is why they wear garbage bags and duct tape. That very likely being the things their bodies were dumped in, the knives they hold very likely being the ones that took their lives. Or alternatively, more simply, they could represent the wee shitters living somewhere else in the apartment, their existence probably being an annoyance to Simon. But they may also relate to Simon via their height, as due to how short these creatures are, the only place they'd really be able to attack him is his legs, which sorta corresponds to Simon's injuries, albeit the connections to Simon are pretty weak. So I would personally say they represent the victims of the PDF serial killer, who probably lived in the same apartment building and killed his victims prior to Simon writing the book while still being under therapy from Dr. Purnell, so essentially before the main events of the game. And with that, those two are covered. Now to move on to monsters that represent Simon's relations to other people. Luckily there's only two of them in this category, and the first of those is the Faceless, which often swarm you in large numbers, albeit they go down much easier than the slowers, so if you got a good amount of ammunition for your gun, they're hardly a threat. Like seriously, if you have enough ammo, you can just decimate these wee shitters. But outside of that, you only really encounter them in three places: the college, the apartments when you go back to them, and the roped off one. And their main advantage against you is early on in the college, that being that they have much greater numbers, and there's darkness limiting your options for fighting them. The best way to deal with them is usually dual wielding the phone and either the VP-70 or the Glock, and popping a few caps in them with body shots. 4 Glock shots to the body, or 2 bursts from the VP-70 on hard mode should do it, albeit do keep in mind you can't reload with one hand, so try to make space for a safe spot when low on bullets. It's also recommended you drop your unneeded weapons before you go in, as you're going to need to pick up some key items as you traverse through the darkened college, which mitigates the amount of backtracking and run-ins with them. Anyway, there's also variants of these things, so we're going to quickly go over those. Firstly, a special variant appears in the final boss fight for ending 1, 2 and 3, in which the player is confronted by Wheelchair Simon. Platforms lowering down into the arena, introducing increasing quantities of the Twister Head variant, these creatures having metallic hooks for heads, except a particular single one called Twister V, which is what's named in the model files. This one featuring a valve for a head, which drops when the creature is killed, and is used to open the gate as to reach 6 Simon. There is another variant found as you return to the apartments. It lies on the floor almost lifelessly to trick you into thinking it's dead, but it will scuttle over to you and attack if you get close, able to move and attack exceedingly quick, having the fastest attack speed of any enemy in the game, which makes melee against them useless, this particular variant being the Faceless Croucher mentioned in the beginning section of the video, albeit weirdly enough this specific version of the Faceless is grouped in with the Croucher enemies, rather than the enemy type it actually resembles. But anyway, it's advised you only use firearms when going against these creatures, particularly the shotgun, which can kill them in 1 or 2 shots, albeit as you progress the shotgun gets gradually phased out by the TMP, the VP-70 and the hunting rifle. And lastly there is the and I quote ghostly end quote Faceless, which rushes you after falling through the walkway inside the hallucinatory sequence inside the bloody apartment room's basement. After encountering the facehead in question a second time, they are very ironically faced Facelesses, which appear to have no body, inside the darkened hall you encountered them in. They're functionally the same as the other Faceless though and can be easily outrun, existing pretty much for scares after a false encounter with the Saw Runner. Regarding their relevance to Simon, considering the fact the model is supposed to be of a female, they could possibly represent that Simon feels as if he's hurt Sophie, especially with how desperately he reacted to her rejecting his feelings, as he can and I quote see it in her eyes. He can see the damage he and his desperation have done to her, especially with his now crippled state. He pretty much feels ashamed to look her in the face, albeit the violent bloody model it has could represent how he kills her in ending 1 and 2 to keep her to himself. But they may also represent the anxiety in a relationship between Simon and Dr. Purnell and how he doesn't trust them, especially with the doctor trying to do his job and figure out what's wrong with Simon by trying to actually talk to him through asking questions about his personality and his life and such, albeit Simon refuses to elaborate on these, which is an idea that gets reinforced by the fact they appear shortly after the corridor in which the doctor talks about Simon's refusal to talk about his personal life. And they could also represent the other students of the college that Simon attended, or more accurately his anxiety with interacting with other people. And with that, now to move on to the next character, and that is Dr. Purnell. But to be more specific, this is how Simon sees Dr. Purnell. In reality, outside of Simon's book, he is a psychiatrist, and is the doctor seen in some of the flashbacks that Simon has during the game, albeit the malicious and sadistic version we see mirrors what Simon views him as. To be more specific, as a strange, untrustworthy man. But actually, you know what, I think it's best I save Dr. Purnell for his own mini video, because 1, I don't want to make this video too long, and 2, because I feel like he deserves it. But yeah, with that, those are the relations to others done. Now we have 2 sections left to cover, the ones that have no known meaning or I'm just not sure what they could be, and the ones representing Simon's mental state, which is the largest group of them all. So depending on how long this video is, I might split it into 2. Actually, you know what? The ones with no known meaning or I'm unsure on what they actually mean, I'm going to cover those now, and depending on how long the resulting video is, I might split this into 2 parts. But anyway, yeah, getting straight into it. First we have the Dreamer. This thing only appears as a jump scare in single player, albeit it can appear as an enemy in multiplayer, acting just like the Crazy Runner. When it appears in single player, as an apparition and screamer, it appears at the very beginning of the You Will Die sequence, which happens right after killing Mace and retrieving the key from its stomach, and then after first escaping the Saw Runner, when Simon enters a building with plenty of rooms. Specifically when entering one room in particular and heading back, the Dreamer will burst from the room's door while making a high-pitched scream. This creature only appears as an enemy in the co-op campaign Manhunt, while entering the forest section of the campaign, in which you'll find many of them. And also, by the way, these things are often misidentified as a woman, but if you actually look at its texture, it has a man's face and a beard. So in reality, this is a scraggly old man living out in the woods with extremely long hair, at least as far as the co-op campaign is concerned, and it was inspired by a nightmare Rumpel had while working on a map, in which a woman in red appeared and screamed in his face as he answered the door, and despite him not appreciating jump scares, he put it in anyway, but in summary it's just a reskinned Crazy Runner. Symbolism wise, not sure what they represent, so that's why they're in this category. Moving on to the aforementioned Crazy Runner, it's a monster first encountered in the forest segment of the game, which becomes the most common enemy faced after, are completely silent until they spot the player, at which point they'll rapidly breathe in a panicked manner as they pursue you with a knife ready. Their melee attacks are quicker and faster than your branch, so you have to be careful with your timing and positioning to get out of a fight with one unscathed. And, I'm gonna be honest, these things are absolute fucking shitters, as they usually appear in very large groups and tend to ambush Simon, so you gotta be very careful in fighting more than one of them. In fact, I honestly don't like these enemies. Like, I remember playing the Manhunt game mode with that one specific friend I mentioned in the last video, and there's a very specific set of stairs in one of the buildings that if you go up it, it collapses and you fall through it. I fell through it and landed in a dark room, turned on my flashlight and got stabbed to death by 10 of these things. And when I finally respawned and went back to where they were to deal with them, the shitters ate up all my ammo. Primarily because one of my friends was a dumbass and opened up a door leading to the underside of the stairs, letting them all out, and we got rushed by all 10 of them at once. I think it was 10, may have been a bit more than that, maybe 12. But regardless, these shitters suck. Probably because I think he set it to difficult or nightmare when we were playing, but I can't quite remember, so whatever, moving on. Next we have the Spitter. I'm not entirely sure on the symbolism of these guys. I personally think that Simon, because he believes that people are saying terrible things about him, it could be that these things are literally spitting shit at him, so they're a literal manifestation of what he thinks people are saying about him. Or they could be related to his crippled state as these things can't move on their own and they're blindfolded, so it could symbolize how he's vulnerable and how he feels lost and stuff. Albeit I can't really pin it down with these guys. But anyway, these monsters are only encountered in the train segment, both in single player and co-op, specifically in single player while Simon searches for the lost feet. They sit suspended from the train roof, and they hang down through the windows, spitting at the player. Once killed, they lose their grip and fall down onto the tracks below, and the closed-in nature of the train makes it difficult to avoid their attacks. And with that, now to move on to the next one, the Face, which only appears twice in the game. In the prologue, after reaching the X in the distance, it jump scares the player, also awakening Simon from a nightmare, and in a room lined with cages of Faceless, the Face is trapped by its neck through a hole in the floor in which it doesn't even acknowledge you, it just kind of swings around biting and staring at nothing. Like it's just swinging around biting it just in random directions. Although it will bite you if you approach it, so it's more an environmental hazard than anything. And it has no known relevance to Simon, outside of potentially being symbolic of how he feels trapped and helpless, along with his self-loathing and distress at his current situation. Overall, the Face is pretty harmless, it doesn't even do much damage when it bites you. It's just really kinda there, all things considered. And lastly, for this section of the video, we have the Watro, which is encountered exclusively in the co-op campaign, and are only encountered and fought at the docks. They remain dormant underwater until the player gets within range, at which point they will emerge and wait for the player to get within attack range, and if they do manage to hit you, they'll do considerable amounts of damage. The creature also has a great resemblance to the human flower, which is in reality supposed to be a larger, fully matured version of the Watro, albeit unlike its larger counterpart, you can actually kill them, the Watro having 160 health. Albeit a tip to not wasting all your ammo on the Watro is to simply jump over its arm when he's about to hit you, which, if you manage to pull off, saves you the much needed ammo, but ultimately that's pretty much it for them. And with that, that's the no known meaning or unsure enemy category finished. Now to move on to the next category of monsters, this one being bigger than the entire previous video, which is why I had to split it into 2 videos when I was initially recording them. And with that, now to get straight back into it, this white section which I showed last video being what we're going to focus on. Starting at the top left we have the citalopram, which is functionally the same as the Crazy Runner, albeit are only found in the maintenance tunnels in the subway levels, in exclusively the single player campaign. Regarding its relevance to Simon, citalopram is a drug used to treat depression, likely prescribed to Simon by Dr. Purnell, but as I mentioned in my video talking about Simon, it's very likely the citalopram medication had the reverse effect of what it was supposed to do, which is a real world documented thing in those who take it. It works for some people and does the exact opposite in others. But yeah, with that's the citalopram. Moving on to our next enemy, the drowned. These creatures themselves have no physical attack unless the player gets too close, at which point a baby will burst out from its stomach and attack you with a knife, albeit the primary attack of the drowned, if the player is exposed to her presence for too long, with at least 1 bullet available for your weapons. The screen will shake and darken with Simon starting to panic, followed by the creature forcing you to put the gun to your head to try and make you kill yourself, at which point you have to rapidly press the left mouse button to resist its influence. If you're successful in resisting the creature, the screen goes back to normal and Simon will cry a little bit after. In regards to how you deal with the drowned, pistol whipping it with an empty magazine is effective, albeit the baby inside will emerge and attack with a similar rate to the citalopram or Crazy Runner. But the creature's slow speed makes dodging back and getting away from it fairly easy. Also, they have the ability to attack in between the door-off sections of the same map, such as the subway for example, so if you're in those kind of areas it's best to just kill them and get them out of the way. Also, if you're holding a melee weapon, its suicidal influence attack has no effect. But anyway, in regards to its relevance to Simon, the suicidal influence ability this enemy possesses is a reflection of Simon's own temptations to end his own life, and its name, the Drowned, could be in reference to how Simon feels like he's drowning in his own misery. Albeit why a baby bursts out of its stomach to attack you, I have no idea. Possibly an abstract way of representing Simon's growing insanity and how it's hurting him, specifically from within, but that feels like a stretch. Anyway, moving on to the next enemy, the Flygar. These creatures are encountered in single player and co-op and doctor mode, specifically after exiting Gustav Park and heading to Waspit Gardens. Flygar is the only flying monster, if you're not counting Carcass because that's a boss fight, across the entire game, and it has 2 ways of attacking. The first being with the scissors it's holding, and the second being an acidic projectile. Overall, it's recommended to just evade this enemy in open areas, but if you're forced to battle one in an enclosed space like the subway station, they are ridiculously devious, as the enclosed space makes it harder to evade them, and they have a higher chance of hitting you with their ranged attacks, albeit you can easily kill them with one shot with the hunting rifle. And it's also worth noting that there's a cooldown period between attacks, and the creature's head will begin to spasm before it launches its projectile, which is a good visual cue of it preparing a ranged attack, allowing you to sidestep the oncoming shot. Regarding specifically where you encounter it, it spawns in a few set locations. After exiting Gustav Park, in Waspit Gardens after digging up the key to the apartment entrance, in both Saxon Avenue and Hanson Square subway stations, the Flygars spawning in after completing certain tasks, in Kirkville near the end of the game, albeit only a few of them, and in Doctor Mode they appear on Preston Road, around 7 of them, as well as in front of the apartments. And with that, now to cover the relevancy to Simon. They are most likely supposed to represent his growing insanity, as well as his crippled state. A common tactic used on insane asylum patients a long time ago was to restrain them to their beds, so these things could represent how Simon views he's going to end up, the floating bed being how these creatures get around. Definitely a nod to Simon's wheelchair-bound state. The creature's hands are also bleeding and there's various slits and cuts, which is definitely related to Simon's self-harm. And with that, that's the Flygar. Moving on to the next enemy, we have the Hanger. These ones are not even actual monsters, they're more an environmental hazard than anything, encountered in the forest area in single player and in co-op. A warning sign before you enter the area saying watch out for the trees. But anyway, they let out horrific screams and drop from random trees with nooses tied around their necks, and if you pass under them when they fall, they'll deal damage to you. And they're also seen in Chapter 8, hanging from literally nowhere. But regarding their relevance to Simon, they pretty much just represent his urge to kill himself. Albeit why it's a woman, I don't know. Or in a more abstract way, they could represent how Simon feels like he's killed his relationship with Sophie. Albeit that's all there really is to say about them. And now to move on to the next enemy, the Hangman. These worm-headed, tortured, upside-down burrito men are completely invincible and instantly kill you if they touch you, and are faced during a nightmare sequence at the end of Chapter 4. These things will pursue you relentlessly, albeit not of their own free will, as they're being moved around by a track system on the ceiling, the maze you encounter them in having 3 hangmen in total. but overall gameplay wise, you can only run from them or avoid them, and they exist more or less to just be an obstacle. But anyway, regarding their relevance to Simon, while they most likely represent his crippled state and his failing mental health, they could also represent how Simon feels stuck, and like he has no control over what's happening. And with that, now to move on to the next enemy, the Psycho. These creatures are very hard to dodge melee attacks, being the second fastest attacking monster, the first one being the crawling faceless mentioned in the previous video. These creatures usually hide in dark corners and wait for you to pass by and then ambush you, which combined with their attack speed and damage, makes them exceedingly dangerous. It's recommended that if you're gonna go against one, just put lead in it rather than try and use melee, because you're very likely gonna get yourself killed. When killed, the Psycho will drop his axe, albeit it can't be picked up. It also wears the same clothes as the Suicider, and very interestingly, the Psycho does not make any noise at all until the player looks at it, which triggers them to run at you and attack. Regarding their relevancy to Simon, the creatures hiding in dark corners could represent how Simon feels completely alone, but the way they attack when looked at could represent Simon's growing bitterness, and his desire to lash out at other people, which makes sense as in the worst ending, Simon wanted to take as many people as he could with him, but being in a wheelchair made that impossible. And with that, that's the Psycho. Moving on to the next enemy, we have the Saw Crazy. It instantly kills you if it touches you and has 150 health, this creature being exclusive to co-op, found in the main co-op campaign, the Manhunt campaign, and the Suicide maps, the creature being a mix of Crazy Runner and Saw Runner, and at one point it appeared in single player only to be quickly removed, being found on the narrow pathway between the TL Trading building and a door towards the apartments where Sophie is encountered, prior to its removal, albeit, in the official co-op campaign this thing appears 5 times. First in Kirkville at the very beginning, after you exit the parking garage. Second is at the beginning of the forest segment, in an abandoned shack, specifically in a room stocked with weapons. Third is in the asylum on the 2nd floor. Fourth is in the lower levels of the subway, upon reaching the city, where you battle it alongside several suiciders, and the 5th fight is in the tight halls of the TL Trading building on the lower floor. Regarding its relevance to Simon, however, due to it also killing other enemies that are around it, it could possibly represent Simon's hatred of those around him, but considering its quick removal from single player, I don't think it's all too related to Simon himself. Albeit if it is connected to him, it probably represents more than just his hatred. In addition to that, it represents his indifference and anger towards everyone else. And with that, moving on to the next enemy, we have the iconic Saw Runner. Being attacked by him is an instant kill if he manages to land a hit, and he has 2000 health on all difficulties, and he's encountered in a few places in single player. The first is in the alleyways of Ronald Street, the second is when you traverse back through the alleyways towards the college. Third encounter is during the nightmare sequence in the roped off room. The fourth is in the forest segment, and the fifth is in the Kirkville sewers. These 5 all being exclusive to single player, albeit he appears 3 times in Doctor mode, the first in a network of corridors after exiting the sewers, second is in the basement of the apartment building, and the third final encounter is in the hallway of the 3rd floor of the apartments, albeit in co-op he only appears twice. The first is in the exact same location he's met in the forest segment of single player, and the second final confrontation was added in 1.2, in which he'll appear one more time in the alleyways where Simon first met him. In both encounters you're forced to kill him and you can't run away from him, due to an unbreakable blockade at the end of the alleyway. Albeit when it comes to dealing with the Saw Runner there's a few tactics. First is stay calm and simply walk, only sprint or dodge when he is directly behind you. This is because the Saw Runner has to stop to actually attack. Secondly, if you've unlocked the camera you can just freeze him in place to give yourself some breathing room. Thirdly, for the forest encounter, it's pretty easy to lose his line of sight by simply turning left and right. Fourthly, he cannot hit you directly when you are moving. Fifthly, keep clear of dead ends. And sixthly, he cannot be stunned like most other monsters in the game, so simply just don't waste your mind trying to. The best thing to do is just escape him quickly. However, if you're in single player campaign, any two-handed weapon bash will stun him pretty good. And with that, now for his relevance to Simon. The Saw Runner, which wears masks covering its head, which conceal its real face, could represent how Simon hides himself from others, and hides how he really feels. He tries to show himself to be normal, but in reality he's consumed by hatred and sadness, or alternatively the creature could represent an anxiety attack, as this thing is strong, fast and can burst its way into your life at any moment. And ironically and fittingly, the best way to deal with the Saw Runner is the same as dealing with a panic attack, keeping calm and trying to remove yourself from the situation. And with that, that's the Saw Runner. Moving on to the next enemy, we have the Sumo. These enemies are found in the sewers first, but they'll continue to show up in dark and watery environments. The creature attacks by coming up to you and launching out a long tongue from its mouth. and the barbed wire wrapped around it can be broken from repeat strikes from a melee weapon, albeit it's not recommended to do this because they become faster and more powerful, so it's best to either hit them in the head or shoot them from a distance. Regarding their relevance to Simon, the way it attacks when caught up in its barbed wire could represent Simon's anger and bitterness by him lashing out verbally. Another interpretation is that the barbed wire represents a straitjacket, albeit this is useless as they can still attack with their heads and cause Simon harm, like how Simon mentally torments himself. And that's all there really is to say about the sumo. Moving on to the next monster, we have the Stranger. These creatures appearing in TL Trading AB, the apartments and the asylum, albeit they're quite uncommon. When approached, they'll begin to attack you telepathically, rapidly dealing damage to you until they're killed. Once defeated, they let out an inhuman groan and begin to twitch and flicker before vanishing. Overall, tactics wise, it's best to just avoid them, when possible, due to the drain on health and ammo they can be, but if the player chooses to fight one or is forced to, it's advised you go at them with the hunting rifle or the M16, but ultimately they're best avoided. Regarding their relevance to Simon, they could represent how the book is starting to affect Simon himself and the harm it's causing him, albeit there's another layer to them. It's possible, given the name The Stranger, that when Simon sees people in the street he's reading them like an open book in his mind, as Simon genuinely believes that a lot of people are saying nasty shit about him behind his back, so the creature's design may reflect this. And with that, that's surprisingly all there is to say about the Stranger. Now to move on to the next enemy, the Suicider. They're encountered in Saxon Avenue, the Asylum, the Subway and Kirkville. They are the only enemies aside from the Dr. Purnell boss fight, who attacks with a firearm instead of a melee weapon. Combat wise, they will charge towards you with a Glock 19, rapidly firing at you inaccurately with zero care for their own self-preservation. Regarding tips for fighting them, firstly they're a good source of Glock ammo as they always drop their guns when killed. Secondly, once it runs out of ammo, it will shoot itself, eliminating itself as a threat. Thirdly, you can either face it in a gun battle, which its large head makes it easy to hit, or you can just close the distance, making the creature shoot itself instead. Fourthly, if the player does not have a Glock in their inventory, and picks one up from a suicider that killed itself, there's still going to be a bullet in the chamber, albeit you'll get a full magazine if the player already has a Glock. Fifthly, be careful on Nightmare mode as they can headshot you. And lastly, sixthly, in the co-op campaign Manhunt, they wield Ruger P345s instead of the standard Glocks. Relevancy to Simon wise, they represent his desire to end his own life. And that's pretty much all there is to him. And with that, moving on to the next enemy, the Taller. These monsters are a considerable threat, albeit exceedingly easy to avoid, primarily due to their slow speed, so you can pretty much just sprint past them without much trouble, and while it's possible to kill them, it's not advised, as it will consume a lot of time and ammo to take them down. As its name suggests, it is the tallest monster in the game. It's also advised you don't get close to them, as they can kill you with exceedingly little effort. They'll punch Simon if he gets too close, which will send you flying and onto the ground, at which point you'll be immobilized, and it will proceed to approach you while you're incapacitated and stomp on you, finishing you off. It is possible to get up after being hit, by either clicking the left mouse button or pressing the jump key, but all instances of the Taller can easily be avoided. However, should you choose to fight it, it's best to go with headshots, their enormous size and slow movement making it fairly easy. Even more so if you're using the hunting rifle. Despite the threat they can be, there's only 4 of them in the main campaign, 3 of them at the back of Waspet Gardens, accessed during the backtracking section, and 1 that randomly appears on the other side of the bus. Albeit in co-op, there is a shit zillion of these guys, spawning in Kirkville, the forest and the city in groups of 3 to 4 at the same time, and very often there's multiple spawns of them, but interestingly enough, if the player can lure a Saw crazy towards them, it can defeat them rather easily. Anyway, in regards to their relevance to Simon, they could possibly represent a personified form of Simon's overwhelming depression. The damage it inflicts could also be related to this. It may also represent how Simon feels tiny, weak and pathetic in his wheelchair compared to those around him. He feels like everyone else is massive and towers over him, and that it would be incredibly easy for them to absolutely decimate him. The Taller could also represent the overwhelming size of the struggle within his own head, and the challenge of having to face his inner demons. And with that, that's the Taller. That completes the first row of monsters in the white category. We're 2/3 of the way through this, but let's not delay and let's keep going. Progressing straight on with Book Simon, he is the true final boss of Cry of Fear, faced if the player kills Carcass and trusts Dr. Purnell with the gun in the asylum. Defeating him will unlock the 4th ending, the only ending which Simon doesn't kill himself. Regarding who Book Simon is the twisted version of the protagonist, silent and bloodied, who is very similar to The Addiction, the final boss of Afraid of Monsters, a game made by the same developers prior to Cry of Fear. But anyway, he attacks the player with various weapons, progressing throughout the fight depending on how much damage has been done to him. First with the Glock 19, then the Remington 870, followed by the MP knowing, and finally a sledgehammer, constantly running away when inflicted with enough damage, albeit when you fight him you play as the real Simon in his wheelchair, and it's revealed you is playing as Book Simon through the rest of the game, and you play as him in the 3 bad endings. But ultimately, Book Simon, armed with a flare and sledgehammer, is gunned down in a dark alley, and once killed it triggers the ending cutscene where Simon survives. In co-op mode however, sometimes the game will turn black and white, and the music from chapter 8 will begin to play. To get things back to normal, you have to track and kill Book Simon, who is armed with a shotgun, and although he seems perfectly real, and physically attempting to go after the real Simon to kill him, he was ultimately revealed to be nothing but a hallucination, albeit from the perspective of the real Simon, Book Simon was dead, which shows how Simon, despite being crippled and broken now mentally, managed to overcome this sickening wretched thing that was haunting him, and finally came to be at peace with himself. Regarding his relevance to Simon however, Book Simon is best described as the final culmination of all of Simon's psychological problems, his depression, anxiety, self-hatred, despair, suicidal feelings, and hatred towards everyone and everything, which are shown through the player choosing the darker paths, such as sparing Carcass or not trusting Pernell, as the Simon played throughout those endings, is the one we battle in the 4th. So in a super summary, Book Simon represents everything wrong with the real Simon. And with that, now to move on to the next monster. Next we have the boss Carcass, a boss fought at the end of chapter 3 in the rooftops, after Sophie's suicide. This creature attacks you by floating around, and shooting projectiles referred to as hook heads at the player. These projectiles tracking your movement and are difficult to dodge, which can make the boss rather difficult for some people, the hunting rifle being the best weapon for going against him. Once killed, he falls limp in his chair and the chair loses flight, falling to the ground below and vanishing. Choosing to stay and fight him, or fleeing to escape the fight, being a deciding factor in which ending you get, staying and killing him being necessary for ending 4, albeit it's worth noting that if you're going to fight him, his health goes up pretty drastically for each difficulty level, along with the amount of damage he does. Regarding his relevancy to Simon, he may be a symbol of Simon's grief, primarily in regards to his relationship with Sophie, Sophie's suicide before the boss fight, along with Carcass appearing directly after, and Sophie's fate if you choose not to fight him, all tying into this. But in regards to the very specifics of this idea, Carcass could represent how Simon's failing mental health, at least from his perspective, has killed his relationship with Sophie, Sophie's suicide representing her wanting no more of it. Or alternatively, the creature could represent Simon in his crippled state, and the grief associated with it, as Simon mentions that he's a sitting piece of meat on a chair, and the chains could represent how Simon feels as if he's tied down, due to his inability to walk. And that's pretty much it for Carcass. Moving on, the next boss we have to talk about is Craig, which is exclusive to the co-op campaign Manhunt, regarding the boss himself being hit by him as an instant kill, and he's very similar to the Sora boss, as many slowers will spawn during the fight. Craig can also be seen in the first chapter as the first boss of the campaign, instead of the regular Sora, albeit he's much easier to defeat. Regarding his relevance to Simon, the creature more or less embodies his guilt and self-loathing, Craig in particular, unlike the Sora, leaning more into the darker aspects, which is evident from the fact this thing is more mutilated, and is far more violent, wielding 2 chainsaws instead of 1. And with that, that's pretty much all there is for Craig. Moving on to our next boss, we have Mace, the second boss of the single player campaign, being found near the end of chapter 2 in the sewers. Mace appears after the book version of Dr. Pernell has fled from Simon after beheading a man, whom he was torturing for the location of a key. As Mace appears, it reveals that it has the key and swallows it before the fight begins. Mace is notably very slow, and unable to see because of the bandages covering his eyes, often stopping for several moments to sniff around for Simon, before using its hearing to continue tracking him, as obviously moving through the partially flooded room is going to make sound that the creature can track. But despite its handicaps, the creature is completely immune to all damage, well, from your weapons at least. The only way to kill him is to turn up one of the 4 valves to power up its respective generator, which will prepare to emit a charge through the water in the partially flooded room, and you have to power up separate generators to generate enough charge to kill Mace, taking care to jump onto dry ground before the electricity can actually be emitted. The amount of generators needed to kill him depending on difficulty, albeit after he's killed his body still poses a problem due to the key he swallowed. This forces you to have to locate a nearby handsaw and cut your way into him, as to retrieve the key by hand. Regarding his relevance to Simon, considering how absolutely fucked up his body is, the creature could represent Simon's inner feelings of being broken, which is reflected by one of the endings. Or alternatively, due to the sheer force this thing can hit with, it could represent the actual car that crushed Simon, but overall, it represents the broken mess Simon has become. And with that, that's Mace. Moving on to the next creature, we have the Sora, the first boss you fight in single player, encountered in the apartment's nightmare sequence. The creature ambushes Simon when you enter its lair, by cutting a steam pipe blocking access to the door behind him, and then begin to pursue you relentlessly around the room, moving slowly but taking giant steps that allow him to keep pace with you. Being hit by him is an instant kill, so you need to keep your distance from him as he tries to close it, and you need to keep away from corners as to not get closed in. Sora himself is immune to all forms of damage, meaning you can't kill him directly. Instead, you need to damage him until he goes down on his knees, at which point an eye will emerge from his back and that is his weak point. Albeit this damage only counts if the eye is open. The fight against him pretty much consists of downing him and then hitting this weak spot. Once defeated, however, he will succumb to the pain, fall to his knees and decapitate himself with his own chainsaw, finishing the fight and the chapter. Also, it's worth noting that his legs are immune to melee damage, meaning you can't bring him to his knees by hitting him in the legs with melee, albeit he takes twice as much damage if it's above his legs. So if you're able to land consistent melee strikes on his upper body somehow, he'll enter his stun state much faster. This probably being so that if you're stuck with melee because you have no ammo, you actually have some form of chance against him. And the eye on his back takes the same amount of damage with each melee hit, regardless of what weapon is being used. And with that, now we can talk about its relevance to Simon. Unlike Craig, he could represent how Simon's inner fears and demons continue to pursue him, in a more general sense, as they continue to push him, and the way it kills Simon, by slicing him in half at the waist, could represent how Simon's legs were functionally cut off from the rest of his body, and that is what ultimately ends up killing him, if you let this thing be the thing that kills you. Albeit Simon doesn't literally lose his legs, this thing bifurcating you, if you manage to get killed by it, being more an exaggerated expression of this. And with that is the Sora. Now we can bring this video to its last part, that being Sick Simon, the final boss in all three of the bad endings. He's faced if you didn't kill Carcass or didn't trust Dr. Purnell. He is at his core a manifestation of the real Simon who was crippled by the impact of the hit and run car, shown at the beginning of the game. Under instructions of Purnell, he began to write the book which leads to the events of the game, and creates the Simon you play as. Regarding the boss himself, after finishing the writing of the book in any of the bad endings, Simon shoots himself in the mouth and Book Simon, the protagonist, is sent to the nightmare world, his own mind. Realm blood-soaked and constantly changing, countless book pages with suicide written on it, Simon proceeds to make his way through the warped, twisted place, and eventually reaches where Sick Simon resides, a lingering depiction of what is left of the real Simon, attempting to fight away his evil twin. The symbolism of this fight itself is a depiction of Simon being ultimately overwhelmed and driven to kill himself. The actual fight against Sick Simon, however, can be exceedingly difficult for those who have no idea of what to do, as Simon will sit out of reach behind several steel bars, gunshots having no effect on him. He'll use psychic powers to throw items at the player, forcing you to jump and crouch over them. The player will also have to fight 4 waves of those unique faceless which were mentioned in part 1, each wave having one that has a valve for a head. The 4 valves being used to open up the gates to reach him. Upon finally raising the bars, Simon will enter the room and absolutely just pummel the shit out of the real Simon, until he goes unconscious and then strangles him to death. The death of Sick Simon results in Book Simon collapsing as well, the conclusion of the battle causing the real Simon to give in and kill himself, and as I said before, you play as Sick Simon in the 4th ending. And finally, covering his own relevance to himself, the area in which you battle him is unstable, constantly shifting and twisting, which could be symbolic of his mind completely collapsing, as at this point madness has completely consumed Simon, along with the sudden mood changes that come with it. This is also expressed by the books you have to climb on, and used as platforms, possibly correlating to how Book Simon is responsible for this, and how this depiction of himself has destroyed him, and the fact he's locked away behind bars could represent how Simon has locked himself away to write the book, isolating himself from everyone. It can also represent how the real Simon feels trapped and imprisoned in his own body. And with that is the final character, Sick Simon, and every other Cry of Fear monster. Now I'm going to give you another 5-second break, as to pause and go use the bathroom or get some water or whatever you need, because this video is reaching an hour long. It's 57 minutes and 40 seconds as of recording this. But anyway, here's your 5-second timer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Alright, with that, now to get into the next section. The side characters like Dr. Purnell, Sophie, the apartment predator, and the cops, who are from the multiplayer campaign. Starting with Dr. Purnell, there are 2 versions of him throughout the game, ones we see in flashbacks and ones we encounter in game. The ones we see in flashbacks being the real Dr. Purnell, while the gas mask wearing version we see throughout the game is Simon's interpretation of him, created by Simon's distrust and assumptions of Purnell as a person. Giving an overview of his character, in reality Dr. Purnell is a psychiatrist assigned to Simon, seen throughout the aforementioned flashbacks, as to help Simon cope with being confined to a wheelchair, and to keep track of his mental progress due to the trauma he endured. All of which is elaborated on in the Simon video, and I'm not going to be repeating it, so go watch that video on Simon if you want context. But anyway, Simon's distrust, stemming from his damaged mental state, and his already pre-existing negative view of everyone else leads to him writing Dr. Purnell in the book as a completely different person, one who is malicious and sadistic, willing to lie to, betray and hurt other people, doing things such as dropping false hints of a biological outbreak, expressing belief that Simon isn't even real and that everyone else around him is psychotic despite the fact he murders 2 individuals in cold blood, along with betraying and shooting Simon, just before the boss fight against him starts. The decision prior to this betrayal, deciding to trust him with the gun or not, being a crucial decision in if Simon survives the ending of Cry of Fear or not. And I'm very sure in a previous video, I've already mentioned how this could represent Dr. Purnell's IRL treatment potentially backfiring on Simon, which it does in 3 of the 4 endings. Albeit Dr. Purnell in the real world, however, is a very different person. He's very clearly firstly a licensed psychologist and doctor, evident from his ability to prescribe the citalopram to Simon, and some of the advice he gives Simon. The pills by itself won't make you feel better, you'll have to do more than that. In addition to this, in Ending 4, Purnell becomes Simon's official mentor in the asylum, meaning that not only does he care for his patients, it means in all likelihood he is a licensed healthcare and psychological professional, one who goes out of his way to do as much as he can. Simon even showing that he is grateful for this towards the end, showing that Simon has realised his misjudgment. But interestingly enough, if we take the Manhunt campaign into consideration, and we treat it as canon, a note in the asylum tells us his phone number, and explains that he stopped working at the hospital and now has his own office at his own home. Albeit timeline-wise, Manhunt is very likely non-canon, as the cop protagonists are trying to stop Dr. Purnell from suggesting the book idea to Simon in the first place. So ultimately we're going to be disregarding the cop campaign as canon. In addition to this, the Doctor's story, which is a bonus story unlocked after finishing the game, in which Dr. Purnell is trying to get to Simon's apartment to destroy his book and stop the nightmare. This goes directly against the established canon of the book all being in Simon's head, so we'll be disregarding this as non-canon too. And ultimately with that, that's surprisingly all there is to say about Dr. Purnell as a character. With that, now to move on to Sophie. Story-wise, Sophie is Simon's only friend, and hidden love interest, albeit Simon confesses his love to her and gets rejected, her fate depending on the different endings you get, her dying in ending 1 and 2, but being alive in endings 3 and 4 and the co-op ending. If a carcass is left alive, then you'll get either ending 1 or 2. Both endings show that Simon has killed her, dumped her body in the bathtub, and then kills himself after. Albeit in ending 3, instead he just kills Dr. Purnell and then himself, albeit he greatly appreciates Sophie's efforts for trying to help him, and simply requests that whoever finds his book spares her knowing what happened to him. While in ending 4, the only people who die are 2 cops who came in to check on Simon killing them in a psychotic state thinking they were book Simon. Albeit if you want more elaboration on that ending, go watch the video on Simon. But ultimately when he's put into psychological care, she comes to visit him. And then there's the co-op ending, which is very likely non-canon, in which the cops travelling through time arrest a hit and run suspect before Simon can get crippled and he walks home holding hands with Sophie. But ultimately regarding Sophie's relevance in the plot, it's surprisingly minimal. Simon being the only one at college who ever treated her nicely, well the only dude who's ever treated her nicely, and she always had problems at school implying she was a victim of bullying. Simon being the only one who was kind to her, both of them meeting in the college, initially, meaning they're both probably around the same age. But anyway, during the main events of the game, we only really see her through flashbacks in one scene involving Carcass. Her rejection of Simon possibly being what created Carcass, an accumulation of Simon's guilt and sorrow. But ultimately during the events of the game, the depiction of Sophie in Simon's mind via the book asks him to meet on a nearby rooftop, at which point Simon tries to talk to her about the monsters, but she has no idea what he's talking about. They have a short conversation on the rooftops, at which point Simon confesses his feelings to her, only to be met with denial, due to her mainly regarding him as a friend. Shortly after, the combination begins to draw to a close, and Sophie expresses a desire to get away from everything around them, which Simon fails to understand the meaning of before she abruptly walks off the edge and commits suicide, dying as she hits the pavement below. This being a metaphorical representation of how Simon perceives the whole situation, and how it's affected Sophie, which is somewhat reflected through ending 4, when he says, "I can see the damage I've done to her in her eyes, every time she looks at me." But ultimately outside of that, when Simon battles Carcass, if he decides to kill the creature, this represents him ending his sorrow for Sophie and his failed relationship once and for all. But if you don't kill it, this represents the guilt being left to fester, which ultimately ends up killing Simon. But ultimately with that is surprisingly all there is to say for Sophie. Now to talk about the last character on this list, and that is the apartment predator, who while there's very little information on, this is going to be more of an overview of the character than anything. As to who he is, the man we see with the shears in the one videotape used to acquire the code for the elevator in the apartments, who cuts off another man's head and drags his body away, said body having the code carved into its chest, could potentially be the apartment predator, as interestingly enough, the unknown caller who we find dead in the bathtub in the apartment chapter is wearing the exact same clothes as the man with the shears in the video, both of them wearing the same jacket, along with being mostly bald and being white older guys. In fact, they both look pretty identical. But anyway, outside of that, in regards to who the apartment predator is throughout the game, Simon never encounters him directly, only finding his secret notes scattered throughout the apartment complex, along with the addition of the picture room where he likely killed his victims. Albeit plot-wise, the apartment predator is probably the reason why in the apartments you encounter the younglings who are wrapped in garbage bags armed with knives. As mentioned when I talked about the Cry of Fear monsters, they are likely his victims. All of this suggests that at one point, before Simon started to write his book, that the killer went on his rampage, claimed the lives of his victims, and then was possibly found dead in the bathtub, and prior to this was living in the apartments without him knowing. In addition to this, the notes he leaves behind are absolutely sickening confessions of his actions, the notes implying a minimum of 2 victims. But considering how he mentions he just wants to keep killing them, it's likely there's way more, so the true extent of how many victims he's claimed is unknown. But I'm going to estimate a total of 16 victims, based on the number of pictures you can find in the picture room, all of which have notes about how the victim died. Some of them saying stuff like tasted bad, so he definitely didn't just kill them, he ate them as well. And some of them have things saying collection followed by a number which has 3 digits, or a date written on them. The highest collection number I saw in the YouTube Let's Play videos being 11, so the number of victims can range from 2 to 16, or possibly even more if this man has prior history. And it's also interesting that Simon has all this written down in his book. This implies that Simon has a good amount of information on this predator, so chances are after the apartment predator died, word about how many victims spread among the apartment, and Simon became fully aware of what happened. But ultimately, I'm gonna be honest, I did not like analysing this character whatsoever. And what really bugs me is that there's more information on this character than there is on Sophie. It just doesn't really make much sense to me from a writing point to put more effort into a background apartment predator character than Simon's literal love interest, and even the psychologist who's helping him get through things. But ultimately, yeah, I did not like researching this one at fucking all. In fact, I'm not even gonna read out the secret notes from this sick fuck because they're so gut-churning in concept that, I'm sorry, I have such a massive hatred of those kind of people that I am legitimately having to break up the recording here so I don't just get into a fucking rage, because people who do that kind of stuff to younglings, I'm gonna be honest, they should actually just be fucking boiled alive. Make their death as slow and agonizing as possible. I absolutely despise them and have had to take a moment to calm down. But anyway, it's possible that the apartment predator could also represent one of Simon's inner demons that is preying upon his innocence. And also, from what I've heard, the pictures you find in the apartment predator's picture room aren't actual real photos, they're all photoshopped. Because if they are real photos, they would straight up not allow the game to be distributed on Steam, as Steam has very strict content policies on stuff like that. But anyway, I want to move on from that. I'm just going to discuss the cops from Cry of Fear multiplayer as well. They're technically characters, so I'm just going to shove them in here so I can officially say we've covered every single one. Anyway, they're members of the Swedish police force, and they're the protagonists of the co-op manhunt campaign. And while they're voiced by Dr. Doozer, they don't really have much characterization. Regarding their place in the co-op campaign, after they get interested in Simon's book case and reading the book themselves, they get sucked into it, and begin a journey to stop the events of Cry of Fear ever happening by stopping the hit and run. In the manhunt campaign, however, upon further investigation, they realise that if they managed to stop Dr. Purnell from becoming Simon's therapist in the first place, all the events leading up to the book's creation would simply never happen. And they then proceed to manhunt for Dr. Purnell and capture him. Albeit regarding their fates, in the fourth ending, 2 of them get shot by Simon in a psychotic episode. In the co-op ending, they prevent the accident that crippled Simon. And in Manhunt, they manage to stop Dr. Purnell from becoming Simon's doctor, prevent the creation of the book altogether. Regarding trivia on them, however, they all have the same voice actor, their hair and skin colour being the only differences between them. And their models were slightly improved upon the release of the Manhunt game mode. Initially, the player had to equip a radio to communicate between them in game, but this was removed because players just found it uncomfortable. And with that is every single character in Cry of Fear covered, and every single monster. I do hope you enjoyed this mega Cry of Fear character study compilation, which I've gone out of my way to try and put together as smoothly as possible. And compiling all of this together on the 15th of December 2024, basically a whole year before the release of this video, because if everything is going to plan, I've been working on a novel this whole time and hopefully Act 2 of it would be finished by now. But regardless, before I end this video, there's a few things I need to say. Firstly, I'm genuinely surprised I managed to cover all of this in just over an hour. That is slightly more than half the time Pyrocynical took. Secondly, despite how burned out I was. I managed to record all 12 of these videos in a month, so that breaks my record for videos produced in a month. My previous character cross-section record being 4.5, that being in October 2024. That extra 0.5 is because Factual did all the audio for the Corn video and the script. I just did the editing and such. But yes, I'm going to try and surpass 12 if I can. Thirdly, I do want to do much longer videos like this, but I think it's just generally easier for the audience and for myself if I do them as like 10-20 minute videos. Like when I did the cannibals from the forest and an analysis of their behavior a while ago, that video took me multiple days to make, just like this one. And I was initially going to split it into smaller videos, but I decided to do one big video instead. But you know what, I'll make the videos as long as I feel necessary. And lastly, fourthly, I want to say two things in this part. The first being thank you for making it this far and to the end of the video. It very much means a lot to me that you'd sit down and watch a very long video like this. And the second being, I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any constructive criticism or advice, do put it in the comments. And if I made any lore mistakes, do put them in the comments and point them out. But yeah, that's all I have to say. Have a good day, afternoon or night. See you around. Goodbye.